Hi, I'm Dr. Ariel. I am co-director of Virginia Wesleyan's Institutional Review Board, and today I'm going to talk with you about how to submit an IRB application so that you can conduct research with human subjects. First, what is an Institutional Review Board, or IRB? Well, an IRB is a university body whose goal is to protect the rights and welfare of research participants at academic institutions. The IRB's job is to evaluate the ethical merit of your research, not necessarily the scientific merit. And IRB approval is required before you can begin data collection if you want to disseminate your results and or obtain funding for your research. In general, there are 6 key themes in ethical research with human subjects, and these themes are present in the application process. These themes are informed consent, that is, subjects should be treated as autonomous agents who can make decisions about whether they want to participate in research. They should not be coerced to participate in research. Researchers should take steps to protect subjects from both physical and psychological harm. Researchers should also take steps to protect the privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity of research subjects' data. Researchers should weigh the risks and benefits of conducting their research, and ideally, the benefits should outweigh the risks. And researchers should also debrief their subjects at the conclusion of their study, at which point any deception should be revealed to the subjects, and subjects should be provided details about the research question being evaluated. Okay, now on to the application process itself. The first decision you need to make is whether your research project falls under Level 1, Level 2, or Level 3 review. Level 1 review are protocols that are exempt from review. Level 2 review involves expedited review of your protocol, and Level 3 involves full board review. In general, projects that fall under Level 1 review are going to be projects that are using non-invasive archival data, and also educational research that involves using normal educational practices in normal educational settings. Now, the decision to exempt your protocol from review is a decision that's going to be made by the IRB chair. In most cases, your research is going to fall under this Level 2 review. This is research that involves minimal risk to research participants, and these protocols will receive expedited review. Level 3 review involves research that involves more than minimal risk, or research with vulnerable populations, and this type of research requires full board review. The first section of the IRB application just requires you to fill out basic information about your research project, enter a title, enter your name and contact information. If you're a student, you should enter the name and contact information of the faculty who are sponsoring your research. You need to specify whether your research is being funded with federal dollars. Also specify whether your IRB has been reviewed previously. And lastly, provide a brief abstract that describes your study. Now, this abstract should provide a concise summary of your research project, so no more than 150 words. And here you should describe your research question problem, your methods, including your target sample, and your hypotheses. Note, typically, a research abstract will also involve results, conclusions, and implications. However, you haven't collected the data yet, so you're not required to include that information. So in lieu of that, just include your hypotheses. The next section requires you to describe your research question in more detail, followed by a detailed description of your method. So let's unpack what needs to go into each of these sections. First, with the research question. Describe the importance of your problem, including practical or theoretical implications. Here you should provide a brief description of the empirical or theoretical motivation for your research question and hypotheses. This section should include citations, but it does not require an exhaustive literature review. And ideally here you should highlight how your study addresses a gap in the literature. Now recall, I mentioned earlier that the IRB's job is to evaluate the ethical merit of your research and not necessarily the scientific merit. Here what we're just looking for is that there is some empirical or theoretical rationale for conducting your research. And you're not just doing research to do research, because note, research involves some minimal risk to subjects, so you should be doing research because there's going to be some potential scientific benefit, and ideally some benefit to the public and some direct benefit to the research participants. And one way of showing the IRB that that's possible is showing that there's empirical or theoretical motivation for the work. Okay, now the next section is the method section. This is similar to a method section that would be included in a research paper. Here you should have separate subheadings for participants, design, materials, and procedure. Your participant section should describe your sample, specifically who will be recruited, how will they be recruited, what is the sample size, what restrictions are there on recruitment, and any other important details about the sample. You should specify the design you will use in your research, so as an experimental, correlational, mixed methods, etc. You should specify your materials and apparatus, so what survey instruments are you going to use, what stimuli are you going to use, and the specific equipment you'll use. For survey instruments and stimuli, you should include these materials in an appendix at the end of your IRB application. And here in the materials section, you should clearly label which appendix the surveys are located at. Your surveys should also include appropriate citations. Finally, you should include a detailed, clear description of the exact procedure you will use in your research. Note that your IRB application may not necessarily be reviewed by an expert in the domain you're researching. So make sure that you're using clear language when describing the procedure you're utilizing. And that should be clear enough for a novice to understand. The next section is on confidentiality. Now, one of the biggest reasons applications get rejected by the IRB is that researchers just don't provide enough details about how they will maintain confidentiality. Note, it's not sufficient just to state that the data will remain confidential or anonymous. You need to specifically describe your data protection plan to maintain confidentiality. So for instance, in my research, identifying information is typically recorded by subjects when they sign a consent form. However, I don't record identifying information in any other location, and specifically, I don't record identifying information on the data I'm collecting in my study itself. So typically, I use a numerical code to identify that data. And importantly, I never create a link between subjects identifying information in that numerical code, so that there's no way to link subjects' data later on to their identity. So that's one method for maintaining confidentiality in your research. If you are collecting data that involves collecting audio or video files of your subjects, you need to get informed consent to collect that data, because note that risks confidentiality. So provide detailed description of how you plan to maintain confidentiality in this section, and importantly, describe how the data will be stored, and specifically how that storage will also maintain confidentiality. So for instance, again, if subjects are signing consent forms that contain identifying information, ideally those consent forms are stored in a secure location. So I would typically store them in a locked file cabinet in my office that is only accessible by myself. In many cases, data are stored in a digital format, especially de-identified data. Again, that data needs to be stored securely, ideally password protected. So describe that in detail here. One thing to note is the difference between confidential data and anonymous data. This is a mistake that people often make on the application. With confidential data, we can figure out whose data are whose, and typically we take steps to de-identify the data. So that's steps I just described previously. Note the researcher promises not to share this information. With anonymous data, no identifying characteristics are recorded. So in this case, it's impossible for researchers to identify participants. So if you're never recording identifying information, your data are anonymous, and that's one way to keep the data anonymous for participants. But however, in most cases, some identifying information is collected, say on a consent form, so you can't claim the data are anonymous in that instance. Now, we need to maintain confidentiality and anonymity in our research to protect the subject's privacy, but there are two exceptions to this. One is if the subject reveals intent to harm themselves or others, or if the subject is a minor. In that case, the parents have the right to see the data. The next section, section D, you need to describe characteristics of your participants. Will you be recruiting both men, women, or only men, only women, or both? What is the potential age range of subjects? Are any subjects under the age of 18? Note, if subjects are under the age of 18, they legally cannot consent to participate in research. In that case, you will need parents to consent to participate in research, and then the subject will have to provide assent to participate. Specify whether the subjects are mentally incompetent, legally restricted, or institutionalized. And ideally, you should be answering no to all these cases, because these individuals can't consent to be in research. You can argue in some cases there's issues with coercion, so you should be selecting no, and we shouldn't be researching these populations. The next section, specify your recruitment procedure and how subjects will be compensated. Don't just state they'll be volunteers. State how you will advertise the study. If you're planning to advertise via email, provide a draft of the email. If you're using the psychology department's online SONA system, specify that you'll be using the SONA system to recruit participants, and be clear about what type of compensation will be required and any restrictions on recruitment. Next, describe the informed consent procedure. Will you be obtaining oral consent from participants? Will you be obtaining written consent from participants? Will assent be obtained? You should also include a copy of your consent form. If you're using oral consent, you need a transcription of the oral consent procedure you'll be using. If you're using written consent, you can use the template that the IRB provides you. In the next section, you're going to describe the risks and benefits to participating in your study. Concerning the benefits, don't overstate the benefits. In many cases, there are no direct benefits for subjects participating in your research besides the compensation they're provided. Note, though, that the compensation is a benefit, and that should be stated here. In most cases, the benefits may be to society from the knowledge gained from your research study. Benefits can also be educational in nature, specifically if you provide subjects with resources during debriefing regarding your research question or phenomena. Concerning risks, if you're under level 2 review, note that your study still provides minimal risks. These could be physical, psychological, social, political, legal, economical. Note that research is not absent from risk in this case, so you need to specify any potential risk here. In my case, I often do cognitive tasks focused on memory. My tasks typically provide no more risk than students encounter in their day-to-day life. Note, though, that there's still some risk involved. Risks include things like boredom, or even potential test-related anxiety can occur because subjects are completing a memory test. So that needs to be specified here. Lastly, you need to specify analyze the cost benefits of conducting your study. And here you should specify how the benefits outweigh the risks. So when considering this, right, if there's low benefit, low risk, here is where there are questions about whether you should do the study or not. High benefit, low risk, you should definitely do the study. High benefit, high risk, that's sort of a murky area whether you should do the study. Low benefit, high risk, definitely don't do the study. And in that case, your protocol will not be approved. Next section, specify your debriefing procedure and include in the appendix your specific debriefing statement here. Finally, sign your application. If you're a student, your faculty sponsor should also sign the application, and any other researchers that are going to be involved in the research project should be listed. Before submitting your application, make sure your appendices contain your consent form, your debriefing form, and the materials you'll utilize in your study. Finally, the last step is to submit your application via email to either Dr. Martorell or myself, And please do not begin data collection until you receive approval from the IRB.